The morning light fell through the oncology clinic's window in pale strips, landing on the X-ray films mounted on the illuminated board like exhibits in some museum of human failure. Silas Cade sat in the plastic chair across from Dr. Morrison, watching the man's lips move, hearing the words, lung cancer and stage 2B, and 18 months with treatment, filter through the sterile air between them. The clock on the wall showed 8:47 a.m., a time that would etch itself into his memory as the moment his remaining years collapsed into months, his months into numbered days. The doctor was young, maybe 40, with the carefully practiced empathy of someone who delivered death sentences before lunch and went home to children who still believed their father could fix anything. Silas had known men like him in the service, surgeons who could saw through bone while discussing baseball scores. He did not blame Morrison for his professional detachment. The man was simply doing a job that would have broken anyone who allowed themselves to feel too much. Silas studied the films, showing the shadow in his left lung, a gray mass that looked almost peaceful in its stillness, betraying nothing of its violent purpose. 45 years of cigarettes had built that monument inside him, one drag at a time, starting with the Camels they passed around at Fort Benning when he was 18, and too young and too immortal to imagine his own lungs turning against him. The habit had followed him through 2 decades of service, through the jungles and deserts and mountains, where American boys went to become American ghosts, and then through 30 years of civilian life that never quite felt civilian. Dr. Morrison was explaining treatment options, now his hands gesturing toward charts and diagrams, but Silas had stopped listening to the specifics. The essential information had already been delivered. Stage 2B meant that cancer had spread to nearby lymph nodes but had not yet metastasized to distant organs. With aggressive chemotherapy and possible surgical intervention, he might extend his timeline to 2 years. Without treatment, 8 to 12 months. The quality of those months would deteriorate significantly in the final phase. Silas leaned forward, his weathered hands folded between his knees. If I skip the treatment, how long do I have before things get bad, before I can't think straight anymore? The doctor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, recognizing the question beneath the question. Without treatment, you'd likely remain relatively functional for 4 to 6 months. After that, the symptoms would accelerate. Fatigue pain, difficulty breathing. Cognitive function usually remains intact until the final weeks, but there are no guarantees. 6 months. Silas turned the number over in his mind like a worn coin. 6 months of clarity, of capability, of being able to look at himself in the mirror and see something other than a dying animal. 6 months to accomplish whatever needed accomplishing before the long dark swallowed him whole. He rose from the chair with the deliberate care of a man whose body had begun its betrayal. I need to think about it. I'll call your office when I've decided. Dr. Morrison stood as well, extending his hand in a gesture that felt more like farewell than professional courtesy. Mr. Cade, I strongly recommend beginning treatment as soon as possible. Every week we delay reduces our options. Silas shook the hand, feeling the soft palm of a man who had never swung a hammer or gripped a throttle in anger. I've spent my whole life making decisions under pressure, Doc. This one deserves a few days. He walked out of the clinic into the bright Montana morning, the September air carrying that peculiar crispness that announced winter's approach. Billings sprawled around him, a city that had grown comfortable with its own mediocrity, neither thriving nor dying but simply persisting like so many places in the American interior. His Harley-Davidson Road King sat in the parking lot where he had left it, the black paint dulled by years of road dust and weather, the chrome still gleaming where he maintained it out of habit rather than vanity. The bike was 21 years old, a 2003 model he had purchased new with cash the same year his son Tommy had graduated high school, and told him that he never wanted to speak to him again. 21 years of silent estrangement measured in miles logged and phone calls never made, and birthday cards returned unopened. The motorcycle had outlasted his marriage, his relevance, and now his health. It would probably outlast him entirely. Silas threw his leg over the seat and thumbed the ignition, feeling the familiar rumble travel up through his spine like a conversation between old friends. The 4-hour ride back to Copper Ridge stretched before him like a sentence he had not yet decided how to punctuate. He pulled out of the parking lot and merged onto the highway, letting the wind tear at his jacket and the engine's roar drown out the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. He rode through the Montana landscape as it shifted from Billings' urban sprawl to the rolling grasslands and distant mountain ranges that had defined his entire life. This was the country that had made him these endless skies and unforgiving winters, this combination of brutal beauty and stubborn isolation that bred a particular kind of American man. He had been born 70 miles from here in a mining town that no longer existed except as a handful of collapsed buildings and a cemetery full of men who had died before their time. His father, Earl Cade, had been one of those miners, a man whose hands were permanently stained with copper ore and whose temper was permanently shortened by whiskey and disappointment. Silas remembered the small house where he had grown up, the way his mother Eleanor would position herself between Earl's fists and her children, absorbing blows that were meant for everyone and no one. He remembered his younger brother Danny, 3 years his junior, with the same blue-gray eyes and the gentle disposition that Earl interpreted as weakness and tried to beat out of him. The memories came in fragments as the miles accumulated. Earl coming home drunk on a Tuesday night, accusing Eleanor of looking at another man at the grocery store. The sound of flesh striking flesh from behind the closed bedroom door. Danny's face tear-streaked and terrified, asking Silas what they should do. And Silas, 15 years old and burning with a rage that had no outlet, swearing that someday he would be strong enough to stop it. That someday had come 6 months later on a winter night when Earl had beaten Eleanor so badly she could not stand. Silas had finally intervened, launching himself at his father with all the fury of a decade's accumulated hatred, and Earl had broken 3 of his ribs with a fireplace poker before the neighbors heard the screaming. The neighbors had been members of a motorcycle club that rented a house at the end of the street, men with beards and leather and reputations that made the local sheriff cross the road to avoid them. They had entered the Cade house without knocking and had a conversation with Earl that lasted approximately 5 minutes. Earl Cade had left that night with nothing but the clothes on his back, and he had never returned. Silas had never forgotten those men, had never forgotten the way they had transformed from strangers to saviors in the space of a single evening, using their size and their numbers and their willingness to do what law-abiding citizens would not. They had given Eleanor Cade her life back, and they had given young Silas a template for what masculine power could accomplish when properly directed. The highway curved through a mountain pass, and Silas downshifted to maintain speed, the familiar mechanics of riding providing a counterweight to the chaos in his mind. He had 3 years of high school left after that night, 3 years of watching his mother slowly rebuild herself while Danny tried to pretend that nothing had changed. Then he had enlisted in the Army on his 18th birthday, seeking structure and purpose and distance from a childhood that still haunted his dreams. The military had given him everything he wanted and more than he could handle. He had excelled in basic training, qualified for Ranger selection, and spent the next 20 years moving between bases and deployment zones and classified operations that he was still not permitted to discuss. He had killed men in 6 different countries, saved men in 6 more, and watched friends die in ways that made the violence of his childhood seem almost quaint by comparison. He had married a woman named Sarah in 1986, fathered a son named Thomas in 1987, and tried to be the kind of husband and father that Earl Cade had never been. He had failed at that last part, not through violence or neglect in the traditional sense, but through absence, through emotional unavailability, through bringing home the ghosts of dead men and expecting his family to share space with them. Sarah had stayed anyway, had loved him through PTSD episodes and months-long deployments, and the slow erosion of whatever softness she had once seen in him. She had stayed until her heart gave out in 2009, worn down by years of worry that her husband might one day not come home. Tommy had blamed Silas for her death, and Silas had not argued the point. He had stood at Sarah's graveside while his adult son screamed accusations that were not entirely unfair, and he had let Tommy walk away because fighting back would have only proven the boy right. That was the last time they had spoken 15 years ago, when Tommy had driven back to Denver, and Silas had climbed on his motorcycle and ridden until the gas tank was empty and the sun had set, and he had no idea where he was. The sign for Copper Ridge appeared on the roadside, faded green letters, announcing a population of 8,127 that had been accurate sometime in the previous decade. Silas slowed the Harley as he entered the town limits, passing the lumberyard and the Baptist church in the elementary school, where generations of local children had learned to read and write and dream of bigger places. Copper Ridge was dying the same slow death as most rural American towns, hemorrhaging young people to cities, while the remaining population aged and shrank and clung to traditions that no longer served any practical purpose. The Iron Reapers Clubhouse sat on the eastern edge of town, a converted railroad maintenance building that the club had purchased in 1971 for back taxes and outstanding liens. Silas had first walked through its doors in 1979, a 24-year-old veteran with 4 years of Army service behind him and no clear path forward. He had been drawn by the same mythology that had saved his mother, the idea that men with motorcycles and bad reputations could accomplish things that polite society refused to attempt. He pulled the Road King into the gravel lot and killed the engine, listening to the ticking of cooling metal in the sudden silence. The building had not changed much in 45 years, its corrugated steel walls now rust-streaked and its windows reinforced with security bars that spoke to past conflicts with law enforcement. A half-dozen motorcycles were parked near the entrance, Harleys and Indians of various vintages belonging to the handful of members who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday afternoon. Silas dismounted and walked toward the main door, his boots crunching on gravel that had been there since before he was born. The cancer diagnosis had begun to settle into his consciousness, now no longer a shock, but a fact, something to be managed and worked around like any other tactical problem. He had 6 months of useful life remaining. The question was, what to do with them. The interior of the clubhouse smelled of motor oil and stale beer and decades of accumulated testosterone. A makeshift bar ran along one wall, tended by whoever felt like pouring drinks on any given day. Motorcycle parts covered several work tables, projects in various states of completion that would likely never be finished. On the walls hung photographs of members past and present, some smiling, some scowling, some dead from crashes or overdoses, or the simple wear of years. Marcus Deacon Webb stood at one of the work tables, his massive frame bent over a disassembled carburetor, his reading glasses perched on his nose in a way that made him look less like a former outlaw and more like someone's grandfather working on a hobby project. He was 61 years old with a gray beard that reached his chest and forearms, still thick with muscle despite the inevitable softening of age. Silas had known him for 45 years, had ridden beside him through situations that would have broken lesser partnerships, had trusted him with secrets that would have destroyed both of them if they ever came to light. Deacon looked up as Silas approached, his eyes narrowing with the perception of a man who had learned to read people in contexts where misreading meant death. He set down the carburetor part he was holding and removed his glasses, folding them carefully before speaking. "Doctor say something you didn't want to hear." Silas pulled up a stool and sat down his joints, protesting the transition with familiar complaints. "How did you know I went to see a doctor?" "Because you've been coughing up blood for 3 weeks and you finally stopped pretending it was nothing." Deacon's voice carried no judgment, only the flat acknowledgement of observable fact. "How bad is it?" There was no point in deflection, not with Deacon, not after everything they had survived together. "Lung cancer, stage 2B. They're talking 18 months with treatment and it may be less without." Deacon's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation of futures that had seemed fixed and were now suddenly fluid. "You gonna do the treatment?" "Haven't decided yet." Silas reached into his jacket pocket and extracted a cigarette, then stopped himself mid-motion, recognizing the absurdity. He put the cigarette back. "They're saying 6 months of decent function if I skip the chemo. Maybe longer with it, but I'd be sick the whole time. Spending my last year puking into a bucket doesn't appeal to me." Deacon picked up the carburetor part again, turning it in his hands without really seeing it. "What are you going to do with 6 months?" It was the question Silas had been asking himself during the entire 4-hour ride, and he still did not have a complete answer. What did a man do with 6 months of remaining life travel to places he had never seen, attempting to cram a lifetime of experiences into a handful of weeks? Make amends with people he had wronged, hoping that deathbed apologies carried more weight than living ones. Simply wait, watching television and eating soft foods, while his body slowly surrendered to the thing inside it. "I don't know yet, but I'm not going to spend it waiting to die. I've spent too much of my life waiting for things that never came." Deacon nodded slowly, accepting the answer without pressing for more. "You going to tell Tommy?" The mention of his son landed like a physical blow, and Silas found himself gripping the edge of the work table hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Tommy was the wound that never healed, the failure that could not be rationalized or explained away. Every other mistake in Silas's life could be attributed to circumstances or necessity or the fog of war, but his estrangement from his only child was purely his own doing. Tell him what? That he was right to cut me off, that he gets to watch me die from a distance like he wanted. Tell him that his father is dying and that some things matter more than old arguments. Deacon's grip tightened on his shoulder. You can die with that anger, or you can die having tried to fix it. One of those options is harder. One of them means something. Silas wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the reasons why reaching out to Tommy was pointless, why the boy had made his choice and deserved to live with it. But the words would not come, not because they were false, but because they suddenly seemed insufficient. Death had a way of clarifying priorities, of stripping away the protective layers of pride and stubbornness that allowed grievances to calcify into permanence. I'll think about it, he said, finally knowing even as he spoke that thinking was not the same as doing. The conversation drifted to other topics after that, the small business of running a motorcycle club that had long since abandoned its outlaw roots in favor of legitimacy. The Iron Reapers had evolved over the decades from a criminal organization to something more closely resembling a fraternal lodge with an unusually aggressive aesthetic. They still ran a motorcycle repair shop and a small bar, still maintained the appearance of menace that kept casual troublemakers at a distance, but the days of running drugs or fencing stolen goods were decades in the past. Silas had been instrumental in that transformation, using his military discipline and organizational skills to steer the club towards sustainability rather than spectacular collapse. He had watched too many other clubs self-destruct through violence or federal prosecution, and he had no interest in spending his final years in a prison cell. The Iron Reapers survived because they had learned to adapt, to recognize that the world had changed and that clinging to outdated codes of conduct was a form of slow suicide. The afternoon faded into evening as members drifted in and out of the clubhouse, exchanging nods with Silas and Deacon, but respecting the obvious weight of whatever conversation had preceded their arrival. By 7 o'clock, Silas's stomach was reminding him that he had not eaten since breakfast, and he decided to ride into town for dinner at May's Diner, an establishment that had been serving the same menu since before he was born. The diner occupied a corner lot on Main Street, its neon sign flickering with the electrical uncertainty of equipment that should have been replaced 20 years ago. Silas parked the Road King in his usual spot, a section of curb that the other customers had learned to leave empty, and walked through the glass door into the warm embrace of grease and coffee and the particular loneliness of small-town American dining. He took his regular booth by the window, the one that provided clear sight lines to both the entrance and the kitchen. Old habits died hard, especially habits that had kept him alive through situations where a moment's inattention meant death. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Carol, who had been working at May's since the Reagan administration, brought him coffee without asking, and took his order with the efficient disinterest of someone who had heard it hundreds of times before. Silas sat alone with his thoughts while the coffee cooled and the kitchen prepared his steak. The diner was quiet at this hour, most of the dinner crowd having already come and gone, leaving only a handful of solitary diners and a young couple in the corner who were too absorbed in each other to notice the aging biker by the window. His mind returned to the question that Deacon had posed. What was he going to do with 6 months? The answer felt closer now, though still not fully formed. He was going to do something that mattered, something that would justify the air he had breathed and the space he had occupied on this earth. He had spent too many years living as a ghost, drifting through days that blurred into weeks that accumulated into decades of purposeless survival. If death was coming for him, regardless, he would meet it with actions rather than regrets. The food arrived, and Silas ate mechanically, tasting nothing, his attention focused on the window and the darkening street beyond. Copper Ridge was settling into its evening routine, lights coming on in houses, where families gathered around dinner tables and children complained about homework. This was the life he had protected in abstract during his military years, the ordinary American existence that had somehow eluded him despite all his sacrifices on its behalf. He finished his meal and left cash on the table, including a tip that was probably too generous, but that felt appropriate given his new perspective on the relative value of money. Carol waved from behind the counter. As he walked out, a gesture he returned with a nod that carried more gratitude than she could have understood. The evening air had turned cold, carrying the first hints of the frost that would soon blanket the Montana landscape. Silas walked toward his motorcycle, his boots echoing on the empty sidewalk, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated almost immediately in the dry mountain atmosphere. He was reaching for his key when he noticed a piece of paper tucked beneath the chrome mirror on the left side of his handlebars. It was notebook paper, the kind with blue lines and a ragged edge where it had been torn from a spiral binding. Someone had folded it, once creasing it precisely down the middle, and wedged it into a position where the wind would not carry it away. Silas extracted the paper, carefully unfolding it to reveal handwriting that was immediately unmistakably juvenile. The letters were formed with the excessive precision of a child who had been told to write neatly, each one distinct and separate from its neighbors. He read the words in the yellow glow of the streetlight, and the world around him seemed to fall away. "Dear Motorcycle Man," the letter began, "I don't know your name, but I see you at the diner sometimes. You look mean, but you always say thank you to the waitress and you leave big tips. My mom says good people are nice to people who serve them." Silas's hands began to tremble as he continued reading. "I need help. My teacher, Miss Holloway, I think someone is hurting her. She had bruises on her neck on Monday. She said she fell, but I know what falling looks like, and that wasn't from falling." The handwriting grew slightly more erratic as the letter progressed, as if the writer had been struggling to maintain composure while documenting something terrible. "I told the principal, but she said I was imagining things. I told Pastor Thomas at church, but he said children shouldn't get involved in grown-up problems. I told a lawyer man who came to talk to our school about safety, Mr. Cade, but he just patted my head and said, I watch too much TV." Silas read the name twice, certain he had misunderstood. Mr. Cade, a lawyer named Cade who had been at the local school. There was only one person that could be, and the realization struck him with the force of a physical collision. "I don't know who else to tell," the letter continued, "but you seem like maybe you could do something. My mom says the motorcycle men are dangerous, but I don't think that's always true. Will you please help Miss Holloway? She's the nicest teacher, and she doesn't deserve to be hurt." The signature at the bottom was written in slightly larger letters, as if the author wanted to. There was no mistaking their identity. Maggie Chen, 8 years old, Miss Holloway's classroom 12. P.S. I'm sorry if I'm not supposed to touch your motorcycle. My mom says other people's bikes are significant personal property. She's a doctor, so she knows big words. Silas stood motionless on the sidewalk, the letter in his hands, the Montana night pressing in around him. An 8-year-old girl had witnessed something that alarmed her enough to reach out to a complete stranger, a man she knew only from his dining habits and his tip-giving behavior. She had tried the appropriate channels, first had gone to the adults who should have listened, and they had dismissed her. A principal, a pastor, and a lawyer named Cade. His son Tommy was in Copper Ridge. His son, who had not spoken to him in 15 years, who had built a career and a life that deliberately excluded everything Silas represented. Tommy was here working on something related to the local schools, and he had received a letter from a frightened child and done nothing. The parallel crashed over Silas like a wave, dragging him under, into memories he had spent decades trying to bury. Danny had written letters too during those final months in prison. Letters describing threats from other inmates. Letters begging for intervention. Letters that Silas had received too late to act upon because the mail system at Montana State Prison was slow and indifferent and ultimately irrelevant. By the time Silas had understood the danger, Danny had been dead for 3 days, and the official report had called it suicide. Silas had never believed that report. Danny had been the gentle one, the one who found reasons to hope even in the darkest circumstances. Danny would not have hanged himself in his cell a week before his parole hearing, not unless someone had done it to him and made it look self-inflicted. But proving that suspicion had proved impossible. The prison system had closed ranks, the investigation had been perfunctory, and Danny had been buried in a grave that Silas still visited on the anniversary of his death. He looked down at the letter in his hands, at the careful handwriting of an 8-year-old girl who had seen something wrong and refused to stay silent about it. Maggie Chen had more courage than most adults he had known. She had been dismissed and patronized and ignored, and she had kept trying anyway, eventually resorting to leaving a note on the motorcycle of a stranger because every other option had failed her. Silas folded the letter carefully and placed it in his inside jacket pocket next to the pack of cigarettes he had decided not to smoke. He climbed onto the Road King and started the engine, but he did not immediately pull away from the curb. Instead, he sat there in the rumbling darkness, thinking about a teacher named Holloway and a lawyer named Cade and a child named Maggie who deserved better from the adults in her life. He had 6 months, maybe less. The cancer would take him regardless of what he did or did not do. But here in his hands was something concrete, something that demanded action rather than passive acceptance. A woman was being hurt. A child had asked for help. His own son had turned away from that request. Silas twisted the throttle and pulled into the empty street, heading not toward the clubhouse, but toward the public library where the computers stayed available until 9 o'clock, and where a man with questions could find answers if he knew how to look. The library was nearly empty at this hour, populated only by a tired-looking librarian and two teenagers who were using the computers for purposes that probably violated the acceptable use policy. Silas took a seat at a terminal near the back, away from curious eyes, and began to type. Grace Holloway. The name pulled up results immediately, the digital footprint of a woman whose life had been lived in public view. She was 58 years old, according to her teaching credential information. She had been a registered nurse before transitioning to education with certifications in trauma care and emergency medicine. Her employment history showed 3 years at Copper Ridge Elementary, preceded by 15 years in various nursing positions as preceded by military service. Silas leaned closer to the screen, his interest sharpening. Military service. He navigated to a veterans database that he technically should not have had access to, but that a friend in the VA had quietly enabled years ago. Grace Holloway née Morrison had served in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps from 1988 to 1990. She had been deployed to Saudi Arabia during Desert Storm, where she had worked as a combat medic attached to frontline units. A combat medic. Silas understood what that meant, the particular combination of courage and competence required to treat wounded soldiers while under fire. Grace Holloway was not some sheltered civilian who had never faced violence. She had walked through the same shadows that Silas had walked, had seen the same horrors, had been hardened by the same fires. And someone was hurting her. He continued his research, building a picture of Grace's life from the scattered data points available to public inquiry. She had married Robert Holloway in 1992, a fellow Army veteran who had died of cardiac arrest in 2019. They had one daughter, Emma, who appeared to live in London based on the international shipping addresses associated with her various online accounts. Grace had moved to Copper Ridge approximately 4 years ago, purchasing a small house on the edge of town before beginning her teaching career. There was no mention of a current romantic partner, but that information would not necessarily appear in public records. Silas needed to know who was hurting her, and that required a different kind of investigation. He typed a new search, Victor Crane Copper Ridge. The results populated immediately far more extensively than Grace's modest digital presence. Victor Crane was 45 years old, a lawyer specializing in civil litigation who had recently announced his candidacy for mayor of Copper Ridge. His campaign website featured photographs of him at charity events and church services, his handsome face projecting the trustworthy sincerity of a man who had been practicing that expression since childhood. Victor was the son of Harold Crane, a name that made Silas's blood pressure spike the moment he read it. Judge Harold Crane, who had served on the Montana State Court from 1975 to 2010. Judge Harold Crane, who had presided over the trial of Daniel Robert Cade in 1982 and sentenced a 20-year-old first-time offender to 5 years in prison for possession of 3 grams of marijuana. The connection slammed into Silas with the force of a bullet. Victor Crane's father had sent Danny to prison. Danny had died in that prison. And now Victor Crane was involved with a woman who was being abused, and Tommy was working for Victor's campaign, and an 8-year-old girl had reached out to a stranger because every legitimate authority had failed her. 40 years of rage rose up in Silas's chest, old fury that he had buried beneath decades of discipline and distraction. He had always suspected that Danny's death was connected to Judge Crane's personal vendetta against the Iron Reapers, that the unusually harsh sentence had been punishment for the club's interference in some business arrangement that Silas had never fully understood. But suspicion without proof was just paranoia, and Silas had learned to channel his anger into productive outlets rather than suicidal confrontations. But this was different. This was not ancient history, but present reality. Victor Crane was hurting a woman, and the legal system that should have protected her was instead enabling her abuser. The principal who dismissed Maggie's concerns, the pastor who counseled non-interference, the lawyer's son who patted a child's head and walked away. They were all complicit in whatever was happening behind closed doors. Silas logged off the computer and walked out of the library into the night air, his mind racing with plans and contingencies and the tactical calculations that had served him well in situations far more dangerous than this one. He needed more information. He needed to see Grace Holloway with his own eyes to assess the situation before committing to any course of action. He needed to understand what he was walking into, and he needed to find out why his son was working for the family that had destroyed his own. The next morning found Silas parked on a side street near Copper Ridge Elementary School, his motorcycle positioned to provide a clear view of the front entrance, while remaining inconspicuous among the pickup trucks and SUVs that populated the neighborhood. He had exchanged his leather vest for a plain jacket, removed the visible insignia that identified him as Iron Reapers, and adopted the posture of a grandfather waiting to pick up a grandchild from school. The building was a red brick structure that had probably been modern in the 1960s and now looked merely tired, its windows reflecting the pale September sun with the indifference of aging glass. Children streamed in through the front doors, their voices carrying across the parking lot in the particular frequency of morning chaos. Parents lingered by their vehicles exchanging gossip and complaints and the social currency that kept small-town communities functioning. At 7:47 a.m., a silver Toyota Camry pulled into the staff parking area, and Silas watched as a woman emerged from the driver's seat with the careful movements of someone managing pain. Grace Holloway in person was both exactly and nothing like her photographs had suggested. She was tall for a woman, perhaps 5'6", with brown hair, shot through with gray that she had cut short in a style that suggested practicality over vanity. Her face had the weathered beauty of someone who had once been striking and was now merely handsome, aged by years, and experienced into something more substantial than mere attractiveness. She walked toward the school entrance with her shoulders slightly hunched, her gait interrupted by tiny hesitations that most observers would not have noticed. Silas noticed. He had seen that walk before on his mother and on soldiers recovering from wounds and on every victim of sustained violence whose body had learned to anticipate pain that might arrive without warning. Grace Holloway was carrying injuries that she was trying to conceal, and she was doing it with the practiced skill of someone who had been doing it for a while. A small figure broke away from the stream of arriving children and ran toward Grace with the uninhibited enthusiasm of a child who had not yet learned to mask her emotions. This would be Maggie Chen. Silas realized, the author of the letter that had brought him here. She was smaller than he had imagined, a delicate girl with black hair and two braids and round glasses that seemed slightly too large for her face. She threw her arms around Grace's waist, and Silas saw Grace wince almost imperceptibly before returning the embrace. The reaction told him everything he needed to know. Whatever had been done to Grace Holloway had been done to her torso, the area hidden by clothing, the area that a careful abuser would target to avoid visible evidence. Grace was protecting herself even as she hugged a child who loved her, unable to fully relax even in a moment of affection, because her body remembered what her mind was trying to forget. Silas watched for another hour, observing the rhythms of the school day, through the windows, tracking Grace's movements when she was visible, noting the way she held her left arm close to her body as if protecting bruised ribs. He saw nothing that would constitute legal evidence, nothing that would convince a court of law that a crime was being committed. But he had not come here for legal evidence. He had come for truth, and he had found it in the careful way a woman walked in the wince she could not suppress in the eyes of a child who saw what adults refused to see. That afternoon, he returned to the clubhouse and found Deacon in the same position as the day before, working on the same carburetor with the same meditative focus. Silas sat down across from him and extracted the letter from his jacket, unfolding it on the work table between them, like evidence at a trial. Deacon read the letter slowly, his expression unchanging, his weathered hands steady on the paper. When he finished, he looked up at Silas with the weary recognition of a man who had seen this story play out too many times before. "You want to do something about this?" It was not a question. An 8-year-old girl asked for help. She tried every proper channel and got shut down at every turn. She left a note on a stranger's motorcycle because she had nowhere else to go. Deacon set down the letter and removed his reading glasses, folding them with the same careful precision he applied to everything. "And your son, the Mr. Cage," she mentions. The question landed hard, but Silas had been preparing for it since the previous night. Tommy is working for Victor Crane's campaign. He got the same letter and he did nothing. Maybe he didn't believe it. Kids have active imaginations. Kids don't imagine the specific details of abuse unless they've seen it. Silas heard his own voice growing harder, more clipped. Grace Holloway is being hurt. I saw it this morning. The way she moves, the way she winces when touched. Someone is doing things to her that leave marks, and everyone who should be protecting her is looking the other way. Deacon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that only he could see. Victor Crane is Harold Crane's son. You understand what you'd be walking into. I understand. Silas met his friend's gaze without wavering. I also understand that I'm dying. 6 months, maybe less. I can spend that time waiting for the end, or I can spend it doing something that matters. And going after the Crane family matters. Stopping what they do matters. Silas felt the old anger stirring again, but he kept his voice steady. Harold Crane sent Danny to prison for 3 grams of weed. Danny died there, and we both know it wasn't suicide. Now his son is beating a woman, and my son is helping him become mayor. If I'm going to die anyway, I might as well die trying to fix something. Deacon picked up the letter again, reading it more carefully this time, paying attention to the childish handwriting and the desperate plea contained within. This girl, Maggie Chen, her mother is Dr. Chen, the one who runs the family practice on Oak Street. She's patched up a few of our boys over the years without asking questions. I know, I looked her up last night. Then you know she's got connections in this town. People respect her. Deacon set down the letter and finally looked at Silas directly. If we do this, we do it right. Surveillance documentation building a case so solid that even Crane's connections can't bury it. You think I'm going to let you die alone on some stupid crusade? Deacon's voice carried the rough affection of decades of brotherhood. 45 years, Silas. I didn't ride all this way just to watch from the sidelines at the end. The decision crystallized between them, unspoken but understood. They would investigate Victor Crane. They would document whatever they found. They would protect Grace Holloway if protection was needed. And they would do it properly with the discipline and patience that had kept them alive through situations far more dangerous than a corrupt lawyer with political ambitions. Before returning home that night, Silas made one more stop. The Sunset Pines Nursing Facility sat on a quiet road outside town, its single-story buildings arranged around a courtyard garden that the residents could enjoy during the warmer months. His mother, Eleanor, had lived here for the past 3 years, ever since her memory had begun to fade and living alone had become impossible. The night staff recognized Silas and waved him through with minimal formality. He walked the familiar corridor to room 14, his boots quiet on the linoleum, his heart heavy with the particular grief of watching a parent disappear by degrees. Eleanor Cade sat in her chair by the window, a blanket across her lap, despite the adequate heating. At 89, she had shrunk into herself, the strong woman who had survived Earl's fists and raised 2 boys alone, now reduced to a fragile figure whose eyes sometimes held recognition and sometimes held nothing at all. Tonight was a good night. When Silas entered, Eleanor looked up and smiled with something approaching clarity. Silas, my oldest boy. Her voice was thin but warm. You came to visit your old mother. He bent to kiss her forehead, catching the scent of the lavender soap the nurses used. How are you feeling, Mom? Oh, you know, some days the fog lifts, some days it doesn't. She patted his hand with fingers that felt like bird bones wrapped in paper. You look troubled, son. What's weighing on you? Silas sat in the chair beside her, wondering how much to share with a woman whose grip on the present was uncertain at best. But Eleanor had always known when her children were hurting, had always found ways to help, even when help seemed impossible. Maybe some instincts survived even the erosion of memory. I got some bad news from the doctor, he said carefully, and I found out some things about Danny, about what really happened to him. The mention of her younger son's name brought a change to Eleanor's face, a sharpening of focus that pushed back the fog. Danny, my sweet boy. Her eyes grew moist. He didn't kill himself, Silas. I always knew that. A mother knows. I know, Mom. I'm starting to find out the truth. Eleanor's hand tightened on his with surprising strength. There was a man, years ago after Danny died, a man who came to see me. He said he knew things about what happened in that prison. He wanted money to tell me. Money I didn't have. Silas leaned forward, his pulse quickening. What man? What was his name? Roberts. Gerald Roberts. Eleanor's voice had taken on the distant quality of someone reaching back through decades of accumulated memory. He was a guard at the prison. He said Danny didn't hang himself. He said other men did it to him and then made it look like suicide. He said it was ordered by someone important, a judge. The confirmation hit Silas like a physical blow. His mother had known, or at least suspected, for 40 years. She had carried that knowledge alone because she couldn't afford to buy the proof that would have validated it. Why didn't you tell me? I tried once. You were overseas somewhere you couldn't talk about. By the time you came home, I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. The mind plays tricks when you want something badly enough. She looked at him with eyes that were suddenly piercingly clear. But I didn't imagine it, did I? That man was telling the truth. I think he was. Silas squeezed her hand gently. I'm going to find him. I'm going to find out exactly what happened to Danny. Eleanor nodded slowly, a tear tracking down her weathered cheek. Good. My boy deserves the truth. Both my boys do. She reached up to touch Silas's face with trembling fingers. You're a good man, Silas. Better than you know. Better than you let yourself believe. They sat together in the quiet room while the Montana night deepened outside, mother and son, sharing a moment of connection that transcended the fog of age and the weight of years. When Silas finally left, he carried with him not just a name, Gerald Roberts, but also a renewed sense of purpose that burned brighter than any cancer could extinguish. The next 3 days established a pattern that would become familiar. Silas and Deacon took turns conducting surveillance on Grace Holloway's residence, a Victorian house on the wealthy side of town that belonged to Victor Crane according to property records. They documented everything, the times when Victor's black Lexus arrived and departed, the moments when Grace was visible through windows, the body language that spoke louder than any words. On the first night, they watched through binoculars as Victor entered the kitchen where Grace was preparing dinner. He said something that made her shoulders tense, and she hurried to adjust whatever she was cooking. When she did not move quickly enough, he grabbed her arm and pushed her against the counter, his face inches from hers, his finger jabbing the air in front of her face. Grace nodded repeatedly, the desperate acquiescence of someone trying to de-escalate a situation before it exploded. On the second night, they saw nothing unusual, just the exterior of a house where terrible things happen behind closed doors. But on the third night, they watched Victor come home drunk, stumbling out of his car, with the exaggerated care of someone trying to appear sober. He entered the house, and 15 minutes later, they heard Grace scream once before the sound was cut off by something they could not see, but could easily imagine. Silas's hands shook as he recorded the timestamp in his notebook. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to cross the street, to break down that door, to put himself between Grace and whatever was happening to her. But Deacon's hand on his shoulder kept him in place. Not yet, Deacon murmured, his voice barely audible above the night sounds. We need more than one incident. We need patterns, timestamps, anything that can't be explained away as a misunderstanding. She's in there right now. And if we go in there right now, Victor calls the police, we get arrested for trespassing, and Grace denies everything because she's terrified of what happens after we leave. Deacon's grip tightened. I've seen this before. You've seen this before. Victims don't get saved by one dramatic intervention. They get saved by building a case so solid that the abuser can't wiggle out of it. Silas knew his friend was right, but the knowledge did not make the waiting any easier. He had spent his entire adult life responding to threats with direct action, meeting violence with superior violence, solving problems with the application of force. The discipline required to watch a woman being hurt and do nothing immediate about it went against everything he had been trained to do. But Deacon was right about the outcome. If they intervened now, Victor would use his connections to turn the situation against them. He was a lawyer, a mayoral candidate, a respected member of the community. Silas and Deacon were aging bikers with criminal records and reputations that the local justice system had spent decades trying to destroy. Any confrontation would be framed as harassment by dangerous outsiders, and Grace would be left more isolated than before. They returned to the clubhouse as the sun began to rise, reviewing the footage they had captured and the observations they had recorded. 3 days of surveillance had confirmed what Maggie's letter had alleged. Victor Crane was a domestic abuser who used his position and connections to operate with impunity. The question was what to do with that confirmation. "I want to talk to the girl," Silas said. "Maggie Chen. She might have seen more than she put in the letter." Deacon nodded slowly. "Be careful. An adult man approaching an 8-year-old without parental consent will raise questions we don't want raised. I'll be careful, but she reached out to me. She deserves to know that someone heard her." That afternoon, Silas positioned himself near the elementary school during dismissal time, watching the stream of children emerge into the autumn sunshine. He spotted Maggie, almost immediately recognizing her from his earlier observation. The black braids, the oversized glasses, the serious expression that seemed too old for her young face. She saw him too. She saw the motorcycle parked at the curb, the same one she had left her letter on, and her eyes went wide with something between hope and fear. For a long moment, she stood frozen on the sidewalk while other children flowed around her like water around a rock. Then she walked toward him with a deliberation that spoke of decision rather than impulse. Silas did not move from his position beside the motorcycle, keeping his hands visible, trying to appear as non-threatening as a 64-year-old biker could appear. When Maggie stopped a few feet away, he crouched down to bring himself closer to her eye level, ignoring the protest from his knees. "You're the motorcycle man from the diner." Her voice was steady despite the obvious fear. "Did you read my letter?" "I read it." Silas kept his tone soft, aware of how frightening he must appear to a child who had been taught to distrust men like him. "You're very brave, Maggie, braver than most adults I know. Will you help Miss Holloway?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. Children were supposed to be indirect, to circle around difficult topics, to require coaxing and reassurance, but Maggie Chen looked at him with eyes that had already seen too much and asked the only question that mattered. "I'm trying to, but I need to know more. You said in your letter that you told other people first. Can you tell me about that?" Maggie glanced around, checking for observers in the manner of someone who had learned to be cautious. "I wrote 4 letters, to Principal Patterson first. She called me to her office and said I shouldn't spread rumors about important people like Mr. Crane. She said I could get in trouble." Silas felt his jaw tighten, but kept his expression neutral. "Who else?" "Pastor Thomas at the Baptist Church. He told my mom that I have too much imagination and that I should focus on my schoolwork instead of grown-up problems." Maggie's voice carried a note of bitter hurt that no 8-year-old should have learned to feel. "Then there was the lawyer who came to school." "Mr. Cade," Maggie nodded. "He was nice at first. He talked to our class about being safe and telling adults if anyone hurt us. After I gave him my letter and he read it, then he—" She paused as if searching for the right words to describe something that still confused her. "He patted my head and said I probably watched too many crime shows on TV. He said grown-up relationships are complicated and I shouldn't assume the worst about people." Silas absorbed this information in silence, his feelings toward his estranged son undergoing a transformation that felt like watching an old photograph develop into something darker and more troubling. Tommy had received a cry for help from a child, a detailed account of suspected abuse from a witness who had trusted him to act, and he had dismissed it with platitudes and condescension. "Mr. Cade," Silas said carefully, "did he say anything else? Did you think he believed you?" Maggie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't think he wanted to believe me. He looked uncomfortable when he read my letter, like he wished I hadn't given it to him." She paused, then added, "My mom says people sometimes don't want to see things that would make them have to do something." The insight was striking in its sophistication, and Silas wondered what kind of conversations happened in the Chen household that would produce such an observation. "Your mom sounds smart. She's a doctor. She sees lots of people who don't want to know what's wrong with them." Silas felt a genuine smile cross his face for the first time in days. This child was remarkable, a combination of intelligence and courage and moral clarity that most adults never achieved. "Maggie, I want to help Miss Holloway, but it's going to take time and I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Don't do anything dangerous. Don't go near Miss Holloway's house. Don't confront anyone about what you know. Can you do that?" Maggie's expression turned stubborn. "But I know you want to help. You've already helped more than you know. But the people hurting Miss Holloway are powerful and dangerous. If they find out you're involved, they might try to hurt you or your mom. The best way to protect Miss Holloway is to let me handle it while you stay safe. Can you trust me on that?" The struggle played out across Maggie's young face, the desire to act warring with the wisdom of caution. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but you have to promise to actually help her, not like the other people who just said they would and then didn't. I promise. The words came out with a weight that surprised Silas himself. He had made many promises in his life, some kept and some broken, some trivial and some momentous. But this promise made to an 8-year-old girl in a school parking lot felt like the most important commitment he had ever undertaken. A child had entrusted him with her trust, and he would not betray it. Maggie seemed to sense the sincerity behind his words. She extended her small hand toward him in a gesture that was almost comically formal. Thank you, motorcycle man. Silas shook the offered hand with the same gravity he would have given a fellow veteran. My name is Silas, and thank you, Maggie, for not giving up when everyone else wanted you to stay quiet. A car horn honked from the pickup line, and Maggie turned to see her mother's vehicle waiting. She gave Silas one last look, assessing hopeful, still not entirely trusting, and then ran toward the car, her braids bouncing behind her. Silas watched her go, then climbed onto his motorcycle and headed toward the clubhouse. The research that followed consumed the rest of the afternoon and extended into the evening. Silas dug into every available record on Victor Crane, building a profile that confirmed and expanded his initial impressions. Victor had graduated from law school in 1998, joined a mid-sized firm in Billings, and developed a specialty in personal injury litigation that had made him wealthy without requiring exceptional legal talent. He had moved to Copper Ridge in 2018, shortly after his first wife Martha had died in a car accident. That detail caught Silas's attention. Martha Crane had died when her vehicle went off a mountain road on a winter night, the official cause attributed to icy conditions and excessive speed. There had been no criminal investigation, no suggestion of foul play. But Silas knew how easy it was to stage a car accident, especially one that occurred on a remote road with no witnesses and no surviving victims to provide testimony. He made a note to investigate Martha Crane's death more thoroughly, then continued his research into the broader Crane family. Harold Crane, Victor's father, was now 78 years old and apparently in declining health according to hospital records that Silas accessed through means that probably constituted criminal hacking. The former judge had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer several months ago and was receiving hospice care at his home in Copper Ridge. The symmetry was not lost on Silas. He and his old enemy were both dying, both racing against clocks they could not stop. The difference was that Harold Crane had spent his final years surrounded by wealth and power, while Silas had spent his in obscurity and regret. But that was about to change. Silas also researched his own son, pulling up records and news articles and social media posts that painted a picture of a man he no longer recognized. Tommy had built a successful career as a corporate litigator, had married and divorced without producing children, and had recently relocated to Copper Ridge to work on Victor Crane's mayoral campaign. The move seemed strange for a lawyer of Tommy's credentials. Campaign work in a rural Montana town was hardly the path to professional advancement, unless there was something else drawing Tommy here, unless Victor had some hold over him that made participation mandatory rather than voluntary. That possibility opened new lines of inquiry that Silas was not yet ready to pursue. Whatever his estrangement from Tommy, whatever anger and disappointment he felt toward his son, the idea that Tommy might be a victim rather than a willing collaborator introduced complications that Silas was not prepared to process. He returned to the clubhouse late that evening to find Deacon waiting with news of his own. I found something, Deacon said, sliding a printed document across the work table. Based on what you told me about your mother's visitor, Gerald Roberts. Silas picked up the document, scanning the information. You found him? Gerald Roberts, former corrections officer at Montana State Prison from 1980 to 1990. He retired to Arizona, got divorced twice, developed a gambling problem that ate through his pension. He's still alive, living in a mobile home park outside Tucson. Silas stared at the document in his hands, feeling the weight of 40 years of unanswered questions pressing down on him. Roberts had known something about Danny's death, something significant enough to try to sell. If that knowledge still existed in his memory, if Roberts could be persuaded or pressured into talking, Silas might finally learn the truth about what had happened to his brother. I need to go to Arizona, he said. Deacon nodded slowly. I figured you'd say that. But what about Grace? What about Victor? I'll be gone 2 days, maybe 3. You keep watching. Document everything. If something happens that requires immediate action, use your judgment. And if Victor does something that can't wait, Silas met his friend's eyes across the table. Then you do what needs to be done, and I'll deal with the consequences when I get back. It was not a satisfying answer, but Deacon accepted it with the understanding of someone who had navigated difficult decisions alongside Silas for nearly half a century. They made plans for the coming days, dividing responsibilities and establishing communication protocols for emergencies. Then Silas went home to pack a bag for the long ride south. He left Copper Ridge before dawn the next morning, the Road King carrying him through the darkness toward answers that had eluded him for 4 decades. The highway unspooled before him like a promise or a threat leading toward a confrontation with the past that might finally explain how Danny had really died. Behind him in the town he was leaving, a child named Maggie waited for a promise to be kept. A woman named Grace endured in silence. A son named Tommy served masters whose true nature he either did not know or had chosen to ignore. And a dying man named Victor continued to do violence in the shadows, protected by money and position and the complicity of everyone who looked the other way. Silas thought about all of them as the miles accumulated beneath his wheels. He thought about the letter folded in his jacket pocket, the careful handwriting of a girl who refused to be silenced. He thought about the promise he had made and the price he might have to pay to keep it. Most of all, he thought about Danny dead at 22 in a prison cell, waiting 40 years for someone to tell his story. The sun was rising behind him when Silas crossed the state line into Wyoming. Before him lay 14 hours of highway, then a conversation with a man who might hold the key to everything. The cancer in his chest was a clock he could hear ticking with every breath, counting down toward an end he could not prevent, but might still make meaningful. 6 months, maybe less. But by God, he was going to use every day of it. The desert outside Tucson shimmered under a sun that seemed determined to bleach every color from the landscape. Silas had ridden 14 hours through the night, stopping only for gas and coffee, pushing through the exhaustion that clawed at his concentration, because every hour of delay felt like a betrayal of the promise he had made. His body protested the abuse with aches that radiated from his spine to his fingertips, but pain had become a familiar companion since the diagnosis, something to be managed rather than accommodated. Gerald Roberts lived in a mobile home park called Desert Vista Estates, a name that promised far more than the collection of rusting trailers and dying palm trees could deliver. Silas found Lot 17 at the end of a gravel road that turned to dust under his boots, the aluminum siding of Roberts's home reflecting the afternoon sun with an intensity that made his eyes water. The man who answered his knock is 82 years old according to the records, but he looked older, his skin hanging loose on a frame that had once been substantial, his eyes carrying the particular emptiness of someone who had stopped expecting anything good from life. He wore a stained undershirt and boxer shorts, his white hair uncombed, his jaw shadowed with several days of gray stubble. Roberts studied Silas through the screen door with the wariness of a man who had learned to distrust unexpected visitors. His gaze lingered on the motorcycle parked in the gravel, on the leather jacket, despite the heat, on the hard lines of a face that had seen violence and dealt it in return. "Whatever you're selling, I ain't buying." The voice was raspy from decades of cigarettes, carrying the flat cadence of someone who had run out of patience for social niceties. "I'm not selling anything." Silas kept his hands visible, his posture unthreatening. "I'm looking for information about something that happened 40 years ago. Something you might remember." 40 years is a long time. Memory ain't what it used to be. It's about Montana State Prison, about a young man named Danny Cade who died there in 1984. The change in Roberts was immediate and unmistakable. His face went pale beneath the sunburn, his hand tightening on the doorframe, his eyes darting past Silas as if checking for other visitors. For a long moment he said nothing, and Silas could see the calculation happening behind those watery eyes, the weighing of risks and benefits, the assessment of what this stranger might want and what he might be willing to do to get it. "I don't know what you're talking about," but the denial lacked conviction, delivered by rote rather than belief. "I think you do." Silas reached into his jacket and extracted the letter his mother had mentioned, the one Eleanor had written, but never sent, found among her belongings when she moved to the nursing home. "Eleanor Cade. You visited her in 1986, 2 years after her son died. You told her you knew what really happened. You wanted $5,000 for the information. Roberts' face underwent another transformation, this time from wariness to something that looked almost like relief. You're the brother, the one who was in the army, the one who joined that motorcycle club. I'm the brother who's been waiting 40 years to find out how Danny really died. The screen door creaked as Roberts pushed it open, stepping aside to allow Silas entry. You better come in. This ain't a conversation for the doorstep. The interior of the mobile home was cluttered but not filthy, the accumulated debris of a solitary life that had lost interest in organization. Newspapers stacked on every surface, dishes piled in the sink, a television playing some game show at low volume. Roberts gestured toward a worn recliner while he lowered himself onto a couch whose springs had long since surrendered to gravity. I figured someone would come eventually. Roberts said, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man confessing sins he had carried too long. Didn't think it would take this many years. Tell me what happened to my brother. Roberts reached for a pack of cigarettes on the coffee table, lit one with hands that trembled slightly, and inhaled deeply before speaking. Danny Cade didn't kill himself. He was beaten to death by 3 other inmates, then strung up to make it look like suicide. I know because I was working that block when it happened. I heard the whole thing. The confirmation landed like a physical blow, even though Silas had suspected this truth for decades. Hearing it spoken aloud by someone who had witnessed it transformed suspicion into certainty and grief into something harder and more dangerous. Who ordered it? Orders came through the warden. Man named Patterson died about 15 years back, so he can't tell you anything. But Patterson wasn't the type to authorize something like that on his own. He was a bureaucrat, covered his ass on everything. Roberts took another drag on his cigarette, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. Week before it happened, Patterson got a phone call. His secretary told me about it later, after she got fired for talking too much. Call came from a judge. Not just any judge, Harold Crane. Silas felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate of emotion that had been holding still for 40 years, finally giving way to movement. He had suspected Crane's involvement, had built theories around it, but theories were abstract, things that could be doubted and second-guessed. This was testimony from a witness, imperfect and legally questionable, but real in a way that changed everything. Why would a judge order a prisoner killed? Roberts's laugh was bitter and humorless. Your club, the Iron Reapers, they broke up some business arrangement Crane was part of. Don't know the details, but I heard it cost him a lot of money and embarrassed him in front of people he wanted to impress. Danny was payback. Young kid, no connections, doing time on a bullshit possession charge that Crane himself had handed down. Perfect target. And you just watched it happen. I was 37 years old with a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage. Roberts's voice carried no defensiveness, only the flat acknowledgement of his own cowardice. I told myself there was nothing I could do, that speaking up would just get me killed too. I told myself that for 40 years. He stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. Your mother couldn't pay what I asked. I was trying to get money to run to get my family somewhere safe before someone decided I knew too much. When she couldn't pay, I convinced myself that keeping quiet was the smart move. Then I spent 4 decades drinking and gambling and trying to forget the sound of your brother begging them to stop. Silas sat in silence, processing the information, trying to fit this new piece into the puzzle that had defined so much of his life. Danny had died because of something the Iron Reapers had done, some interference with Crane's business that Silas had not even been aware of at the time. His brother had paid the price for the club's actions, and no one had told him, and he had spent 40 years blaming himself for not doing more when the fault had never been his to carry. I need you to write this down, Silas said finally. Everything you just told me. Names, dates, what you saw, what you heard. Sign it and date it. Roberts nodded slowly, the gesture of a man who had been expecting this request. I'm dying, you know. Prostate cancer spread to my bones. Doctors give me a few months, maybe less. He met Silas's eyes with something that might have been the remnants of dignity. I've been waiting for someone to come so I could unburden myself before the end. I'll write it all down. Won't make up for what I did or didn't do, but maybe it'll count for something. It'll count for something, Silas said, and he meant it. They spent the next 3 hours at Roberts's kitchen table, the old man writing in a cramped hand that grew increasingly shaky as fatigue and emotion took their toll. Silas prompted him with questions, when his memory faltered, guided him toward the specific details that would give the document credibility. When it was finished, Roberts signed and dated each page, and Silas photographed everything with his phone before folding the originals into his jacket. "What are you going to do with it?" Roberts asked as Silas prepared to leave. "I'm going to use it to destroy Harold Crane and his son." Silas paused at the door, looking back at the broken man who had carried this secret for so long. Danny was 22 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He was gentle and kind, and he never hurt anyone. They killed him to send a message to people who weren't even there to receive it. Roberts's eyes glistened with moisture that might have been tears. "I know. I've thought about him every day since. His face won't let me forget." "Good," Silas said and walked out into the Arizona sun. The ride back to Montana took longer than the journey south, partly because exhaustion was finally catching up with him, and partly because his mind was processing information that demanded attention. He stopped for 6 hours of sleep at a motel in Salt Lake City, lying awake for most of it, as the implications of Roberts's confession rippled through his understanding of the past. The Iron Reapers had done something in 1982 that had angered Harold Crane enough to order a murder in retaliation. Silas needed to know what that something was, needed to understand the full scope of Crane's corruption before he could effectively use the information against Victor. The sins of the father might illuminate the nature of the son, and Silas intended to exploit every connection he could find. He reached Copper Ridge late on the second evening, riding directly to the clubhouse rather than his own home. Deacon was waiting with coffee and questions, his weathered face showing the strain of 2 days of solo surveillance and mounting concern for his absent friend. "You look like 40 miles of bad road," Deacon observed, as Silas lowered himself onto a chair with movements that betrayed every one of his 64 years. "Feel like 60. Silas accepted the coffee and drank deeply, letting the heat revive him. Roberts talked. "I've got a signed statement saying Danny was murdered on Harold Crane's orders." Deacon's expression shifted from concern to something harder and more focused. "That's enough to reopen the case." "Maybe. Probably not after 40 years with most of the witnesses dead, but it's enough to cause problems for the Cranes if it goes public, and it gives us leverage." Silas set down the coffee cup and reached for the documents in his jacket. "What happened here while I was gone?" The report Deacon delivered was comprehensive and troubling. Victor Crane had been more active than usual during Silas's absence, hosting campaign events and making public appearances that emphasized his image as a community leader and family man. Grace Holloway had accompanied him to 2 of these events, her smile bright and her body language betraying nothing of what happened behind closed doors. But Deacon had also documented 3 incidents of aggression that occurred at the house, visible through windows, that Victor apparently believed no one was watching. He had grabbed Grace by the arm hard enough to leave bruises. He had thrown a plate against the wall during an argument. He had cornered her in the kitchen with body language that promised violence, even if the violence itself remained off camera. "She's getting worse," Deacon said quietly. "You can see it in how she moves, how she holds herself. He's breaking her down piece by piece. We need to move faster." Silas stood pacing despite his exhaustion. "I want to talk to Grace directly. Let her know she has options." "That's risky. If Victor finds out, we deal with it. But she needs to know someone sees her, someone believes her. Right now, she probably thinks she's invisible, that everyone has accepted Victor's version of who they are as a couple." Deacon considered this for a long moment before nodding. "There's a park on the edge of town. Grace walks there sometimes after school during the hour before Victor gets home from work. Might be your best chance for a private conversation." Silas filed the information away, then returned to the question that had been burning in his mind throughout the long ride home. "I need to know what happened in 1982. What did the club do that pissed off Harold Crane enough to kill Danny Baum?" Deacon's face went carefully neutral in a way that immediately told Silas he was hiding something. "That was before my time as an officer. I was just a prospect in 1982. But you know, you've been around long enough to hear the stories." The silence stretched between them, weighted with history and loyalty, and the complicated bonds that held the Iron Reapers together across decades of shared experience. Finally, Deacon spoke, his voice carrying the reluctance of a man revealing secrets he had sworn to protect. There was a human trafficking operation running through Montana in the early 80s. Girls from Canada, mostly indigenous women, who wouldn't be missed being moved through to Point South. Some of them ended up in brothels, some in private collections, some just disappeared entirely. Silas felt his stomach clench. He had heard rumors over the years, fragments of stories about the club's past that never quite cohered into a complete picture. The club was involved. No, Deacon's denial was immediate and firm. The club found out about it and shut it down. Some of our members had connections in the tribal communities, heard about girls going missing, started investigating on their own. They tracked the operation to a warehouse outside Billings, all in an anonymous tip to the FBI, and when the feds didn't move fast enough, they went in themselves. And Crane was part of this operation. Crane was providing legal cover, setting up shell companies, intimidating witnesses, making sure any arrest that happened would fall apart before trial. When the club exposed the operation, Crane lost a lot of money and a lot of face with people who didn't appreciate exposure. Deacon paused, his expression heavy with old grief. 2 months later, Danny got arrested on that possession charge. 4 months after that, he was dead. Silas absorbed this information in silence, feeling his understanding of his brother's death shift and deepen. Danny had died not because of random cruelty or prison violence, but as calculated punishment for something the Iron Reapers had done. Something good, something righteous, something that had saved lives and disrupted a monstrous enterprise. Danny had paid the price for the club's conscience, and Silas had not even known why. Why didn't anyone tell me? By the time we put it together, Danny was already gone, and you were halfway around the world on some mission we couldn't even get details about. Deacon's voice carried the weight of decades-old regret. Later, after you came back and joined up, the older members decided it was better not to burden you with knowledge that would just cause pain. They meant well. They were wrong. Silas wanted to be angry at the deception, at the years of not knowing, at the conspiracy of silence that had kept him from understanding his own brother's death. But anger required energy he no longer had in abundance, and the information itself was more important than the circumstances of its revelation. Danny had died a martyr to something worth believing in, and that knowledge, however painful, was better than the meaningless tragedy Silas had believed for 40 years. Harold Crane is dying, Silas said. Cancer like me. He doesn't have long. You planning to visit him? I'm planning to look him in the eye and make him admit what he did. Then I'm planning to make sure his son pays for carrying on the family tradition of destroying innocent people. Deacon rose from his chair and crossed to where Silas stood, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. We're with you, whatever you need, however this plays out. Danny was one of us too, even though he never wore the patch. His death was on all of us, and his justice belongs to all of us too. The words carried a weight that went beyond their simple meaning, an acknowledgement of shared responsibility and collective commitment that had defined the Iron Reapers at their best. Silas nodded, not trusting his voice, and they stood together in the dim clubhouse while the Montana night deepened around them. The next afternoon found Silas seated on a park bench at the edge of Copper Ridge, watching Grace Holloway walk the gravel paths between dying flower beds and evergreen shrubs. She moved slowly, favoring her left side, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her feet, as if looking up required more courage than she could muster. Silas waited until she had completed a full circuit of the park and was heading toward the exit before rising to intercept her. He positioned himself in her path, hands visible, posture non-threatening, and watched her startle at his sudden appearance. Miss Holloway, my name is Silas Cade. I was hoping we could talk. Her eyes went wide with alarm, and he could see her body tensing for flight. She recognized him. He realized, or at least recognized, what he represented: the leather jacket, the boots, the weathered face of a man who had lived hard and looked it. To a woman in her situation, any unfamiliar male presence was a potential threat. I don't know you. Her voice was steady despite her obvious fear. Please let me pass. One of your students wrote me a letter. Silas made no move to block her path, giving her the option to walk away if she chose. A girl named Maggie Chen. She's worried about you. The fear in Grace's expression transformed into something more complex: hope and suspicion in the desperate caution of someone who had learned not to trust kindness that appeared without explanation. I don't know what you're talking about. She says someone is hurting you. She says she told other adults and no one listened. So she left a note on my motorcycle asking for help. Grace's composure cracked for just a moment, moisture glistening in her eyes before she blinked it away. Maggie is imaginative. Children often misinterpret things they don't understand. Children are often more perceptive than adults give them credit for. Silas took a step back, increasing the distance between them. I'm not here to force you into anything. I'm not here to make decisions for you. I just wanted you to know that someone sees what's happening. Someone believes you. And when you're ready to leave, there are people who will help you do it safely. You don't know anything about my life. I know that Victor Crane has been hurting you for months. I know that he controls what you wear and where you go and who you talk to. I know that he's careful to leave marks where clothes will cover them. Silas's voice remained gentle despite the harshness of the words. I know, because I've seen it before in other women and my own mother. The patterns don't change much generation to generation. Grace's control finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks even as her expression remained frozen. You can't help me. No one can help me. He's too powerful, too connected. If I try to leave, he'll destroy me. And if that's not enough, she stopped herself, the words catching in her throat. If that's not enough, what? Grace looked around, making sure they were alone. I have a daughter, Emma. She lives in London, works for an American law firm there. Victor has friends everywhere. He's made it clear that if I ever try to leave him, if I ever tell anyone what happens in our house, he'll make sure Emma's career is destroyed. Her husband is British, trying to get a work visa for the United States. Victor knows people at immigration. He can make their lives impossible. The revelation landed with the weight of understanding. Grace was not staying because she was weak or because she believed Victor's lies about love. She was staying because she was protecting her daughter, sacrificing herself to keep someone she loved safe from a man who used leverage like a weapon. I was a combat medic, Grace continued, her voice bitter. Desert Storm. I've saved lives under fire, kept my hands steady while mortars fell around me. I'm not afraid of being hurt, but I can't let him hurt Emma. She doesn't even know what's happening. She thinks I'm happy, thinks Victor is wonderful. I can't destroy her image of her mother and ruin her career at the same time. Silas reached into his pocket and extracted a slip of paper with a phone number written on it. This is how to reach me, day or night, whenever you're by me. I can't promise to solve everything, but I can promise that you won't face Victor alone, my boss. And maybe together we can find a way to protect both you and Emma. Grace stared at the paper as if it might bite her hand trembling as she reached for it. Why would you help a stranger? Because a brave little girl asked me to, and because I've spent too much of my life looking away from things I should have faced. Silas stepped aside, clearing her path to the exit. The choice is yours. It has to be. But you don't have to make it alone. He watched her walk away, the paper clutched in her hand, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. She did not look back, did not acknowledge him further, but she did not throw away the number either. It was a small victory, a seed planted in soil that might or might not prove fertile. The rest would depend on Grace herself, on whether she could find the courage that had been systematically beaten out of her. Silas returned to his motorcycle and rode to the hospital on the north edge of town, where Harold Crane lay dying in a private room that his money and influence had secured despite the limited facilities of a rural medical center. The staff did not question his presence as he walked through the corridors. With the confidence of someone who belonged there did not stop him when he pushed open the door to the room 318 and stepped inside. Harold Crane at 78 was a diminished version of the man who had sent Danny to his death. The cancer had eaten away at him, leaving skin stretched over bones, leaving eyes sunken in a face that had once projected authority and menace. Medical equipment surrounded his bed, pumping fluids in and draining fluids out, maintaining the biological processes of a body that had already begun its surrender. But the eyes that turned towards Silas were still sharp, still carrying the cold intelligence that had allowed Harold Crane to accumulate power and wield it without conscience. Recognition flickered in those eyes, followed by something that might have been amusement. Silas Cade. The voice was weak but distinct, each word precisely articulated, despite the obvious effort required. The brother, I wondered if you'd come. You know who I am. I've known who you were since before Danny ever set foot in my courtroom. Harold's lips curved into a smile that contained no warmth. You were quite the topic of discussion in certain circles. The Army Ranger who joined an outlaw motorcycle club. Some people thought you'd be trouble, I thought you'd be entertainment. Silas moved closer to the bed, looking down at the man who had destroyed his family. I know what you did. I have a witness, a signed statement. I know you ordered Danny killed. Do you, Harold's amusement seemed to deepen. And what do you intend to do with this knowledge? I'm dying, Mr. Cade. Perhaps you've noticed. Whatever punishment you imagine I deserve, the universe is already administering it with far more creativity than you could manage. I intend to destroy your legacy, your son, your reputation, everything you built on the foundation of other people's suffering. My son. Something shifted in Harold's expression, a crack in the armor of sardonic detachment. Victor is a disappointment in many ways, but he carries on certain family traditions. Is that what this is about? Have you discovered Victor's hobbies? I know he's beating a woman. I know you spent your career protecting abusers and enabling corruption. I know you ordered the murder of a 22-year-old boy who had never harmed anyone because his brother's motorcycle club inconvenienced your business interests. Harold was quiet for a long moment, his breath rattling in his chest, his eyes fixed on Silas with an intensity that the dying body could barely support. Your brother was collateral damage in a war that had nothing to do with him personally. I regret the necessity, but I do not regret the decision. The Iron Reapers cost me $500,000 and destroyed relationships it took years to build. There had to be consequences. He was 22 years old. He was in prison for possessing 3 grams of marijuana. You gave him a 5-year sentence for a first offense, then you had him murdered. I gave him a sentence that would keep him accessible long enough to serve his purpose. Harold's voice carried no remorse, only the clinical detachment of a man reviewing business decisions. If your club had simply accepted the loss and moved on, Danny would have served his time and gone free. But the Iron Reapers kept pushing, kept investigating, kept trying to connect me to operations that were none of their concern. Danny was a message. Unfortunately, it was a message your club proved too stupid to receive. Silas felt his hands clench into fists, felt the violence that had defined so much of his life rising up and demanding expression. He could end Harold Crane right now, could squeeze the life out of this withered throat and call it justice. The man was dying anyway. It would be mercy combined with vengeance, a fitting conclusion to 40 years of waiting. But he had made a different choice, now had committed to a path that required discipline rather than impulse. Killing Harold Crane would accomplish nothing except turning Silas into a murderer in the final months of his own life. The old man's death was coming regardless. What mattered was what happened to his legacy, his son, the corrupt empire he had built. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you were, Silas said quietly. Every deal you made, every life you destroyed, every innocent person who suffered because of your greed. Victor is going to prison for what he's done, and the Crane name is going to become synonymous with everything rotten in this state. Harold laughed, a sound that dissolved into coughing that left flecks of blood on his lips. You think you can touch Victor? He has connections you can't imagine. People who owe him, people who fear him, people who profit from protecting him. You're an old man on a motorcycle with a dying body and a grudge. Victor will crush you without breaking a sweat. Maybe. Silas turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at the man in the bed. But I've been underestimated before. It usually works out in my favor. He left Harold Crane alone with his machines and his cancer and the weight of sins that would follow him into whatever darkness waited beyond death. Silas pulled out his phone, checking that the voice recording app had captured every word of Harold's confession. The old man had been too arrogant, too confident in his approaching death to consider that someone might be documenting his admissions. It wasn't a courtroom confession, wouldn't hold up as legal evidence, but it was something. Another piece in the puzzle, another nail in the coffin of the Crane legacy. The confrontation had not provided the satisfaction Silas had imagined, the cathartic release of facing the architect of his brother's murder. Instead, it had clarified the nature of his enemy, a man who felt no remorse, who calculated human lives in terms of profit and loss, who had raised a son in his own image. Victor Crane would be more difficult to destroy than his father. But Silas had acquired resources that changed the equation. Roberts' testimony provided historical context. The surveillance footage documented current abuse. The recording of Harold's confession added another layer of evidence. And somewhere in the accumulated corruption of the Crane family, there had to be pressure points that could be exploited. The situation escalated 3 days later when Victor Crane's campaign discovered that someone had been conducting surveillance on his home. One of Victor's security consultants had noticed the patterns. Vehicles parked too long in certain locations, the same faces appearing in different contexts, the subtle signs of organized observation that a trained eye could detect. Silas learned of this development from an unexpected source, his son Tommy, who appeared at the clubhouse on a Thursday evening, looking like a man who had not slept in days. The younger Cade stood in the doorway of the Iron Reaper's headquarters, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his face carrying the haunted expression of someone whose certainties had begun to crumble. Silas rose from the table where he had been reviewing documents with Deacon, facing his estranged son across the length of the room. 15 years of silence stretched between them, a gulf that words alone could not bridge. But Tommy was here, which meant something had driven him to cross boundaries he had sworn were permanent. Victor knows someone is watching him. Tommy's voice was flat, stripped of the professional polish that usually characterized his speech. He thinks it's the Iron Reapers. He thinks you're responsible. Why would he think that? Because he's not stupid. Tommy moved further into the room, his eyes taking in the details of the clubhouse, the motorcycles, the photographs, the accumulated artifacts of a world he had spent his adult life rejecting. And because I told him about you, about us, about the fact that my father is a founding member of this club, Silas felt Deacon tense beside him, felt a sudden calculation of threats and responses that combat-trained minds automatically performed. You told him about me. He asked why a lawyer named Cade would be working on his campaign. He did his research. Tommy's laugh was bitter and hollow. He knows everything, Dad. He knows about Danny, about Mom, about your service record and your criminal history. He's been holding it over me since the day I signed on. Holding what over you? The question hung in the air while Tommy's composure finally cracked, revealing the frightened young man beneath the professional facade. There was an incident in Denver, a case where I made a mistake. Victor found out about it somehow, and he's been using it to keep me in line ever since. Silas absorbed this information, feeling his understanding of the situation shift once again. Tommy was not a willing collaborator, but a victim trapped in Victor's web by secrets and leverage, and the same manipulation tactics that kept Grace Holloway imprisoned in her own home. What kind of mistake? I suppressed evidence in a corporate case. The client was threatening my family, not you, Tommy added quickly, but people I cared about. I made a choice and now Victor owns me because of it. So leave. Walk away. Whatever he has on you, we can deal with it. It's not that simple. Tommy ran his hands through his hair, the gesture of a man at the end of his resources. Victor has connections everywhere. The state bar, the courts, law enforcement. If I cross him, he'll destroy my career and probably have me disbarred. Everything I've built, everything I've worked for, everything you've worked for was built on staying silent while innocent people got hurt. Silas's voice was harder now, the patience he had been exercising starting to fray. Maggie Chen came to you with evidence that a woman was being abused. You patted her on the head and walked away. Tommy's face went white. I didn't know. I thought she was just a kid with an active imagination. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. Dad, please. The word came out cracked, a fragment of the relationship they had once shared breaking through the layers of estrangement. I'm trying to make this right. That's why I'm here. Victor is planning something, and you need to know about it. The warning cut through Silas's anger, refocusing his attention on the immediate threat. What is he planning? He's going to frame the Iron Reapers for harassment and stalking. He's got a security company documenting your surveillance, and he's planning to have you arrested before the election. He wants to use you as proof that he's a victim of criminal elements trying to undermine legitimate political processes. Deacon swore quietly, his mind clearly racing through the implications. If we get arrested now, everything we've documented becomes tainted. Any evidence we've gathered looks like the product of criminal activity rather than investigation. That's exactly what Victor is counting on. Tommy's voice was steadier now, as if delivering useful information had given him a sense of purpose. He's scheduled a press conference for Monday. He's going to announce the arrests and position himself as the law and order candidate who won't be intimidated by outlaw motorcycle gangs. Silas looked at his son, seeing for the first time the man Tommy had become, rather than the boy he remembered. The years had not been kind to either of them, but they had shaped Tommy into someone who could recognize injustice, even when participating in it, who could find the courage to warn his enemies, even while serving their cause. "Why are you telling me this? Victor will know it came from you." "Because I can't keep pretending anymore." Tommy's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I've spent 15 years hating you for things that weren't your fault. And 10 minutes ago, I was helping a man who's worse than anything I either accused you of being. I don't know how to fix what I've done, but I can at least stop making it worse." The confession hung in the air between them, a bridge thrown across the gulf of their estrangement. Silas wanted to reach out to embrace the son he had lost, to speak the words that might begin the process of reconciliation. But there was no time for sentiment, not with Victor Crane preparing to destroy everything they had worked for. "Can you delay the press conference? Buy us time to move our evidence somewhere safe?" Tommy shook his head. "Victor doesn't trust me with operational details anymore. I'm window dressing at this point, a prop he uses to show that even the family of Iron Reaper's members supports his campaign. Then we need to move faster than he expects." Silas turned to Deacon. "Get everyone together. We're accelerating the timeline." The next 72 hours became a blur of activity and improvisation. Silas and his allies worked around the clock, copying their surveillance footage to multiple locations, documenting the chain of custody for every piece of evidence, preparing for the legal assault that Victor was about to unleash. But the most important development came from Grace herself. She called the number Silas had given her at 3 in the morning on Sunday, her voice trembling with terror and determination in equal measure. "He's going to kill me." The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other in their urgency. "He found out someone's been watching the house, and he thinks I'm involved. He said after the election, after he's secured the position, he's going to make sure I never talk to anyone about anything." Silas was already pulling on his phone pressed to his ear. "Where are you right now?" "In the bathroom. He's asleep, but he put something in front of the bedroom door so he'll hear if I try to leave." Grace's breath was ragged, the sound of someone fighting panic. "I found documents in his office about his first wife, about how she really died. It wasn't an accident, and I've been documenting everything, my injuries, his threats, all of it. I have evidence, enough to destroy him." "What about Emma? Has he made any new threats about her?" "He called someone yesterday. I heard him mention her firm, mention her husband's visa application." "He's not bluffing, Silas. He has the connections to ruin her." "Then we need to protect her, too. I have a lawyer, my son actually, who can help. But first we need to get you out of that house." "How he'll hear the door?" Silas thought quickly, mapping the layout of the Crane house from his surveillance work. "Is there a window in the bathroom, one you could fit through?" "Yes, but it's on the second floor. We'll have someone waiting below to catch you. Can you be ready in 20 minutes? The pause that followed was pregnant with fear and calculation, the weighing of certain danger against uncertain hope. Grace's response carried the resolve of a soldier, the combat medic, who had kept her hands steady under mortar fire. "I'll be ready. And Silas, I'm bringing everything. Every document, every photo, every recording. Victor isn't going to talk his way out of this." Silas assembled his team with the efficiency of someone who had coordinated operations far more dangerous than a domestic rescue. Deacon would drive the vehicle that would carry Grace to safety. 2 other club members would provide lookout and backup. Tommy, who had remained at the clubhouse since his warning, would stay behind to establish an alibi that might protect him from Victor's retaliation. They reached the Crane house at 3:47 a.m., parking a block away and approaching on foot. The neighborhood was silent, the wealthy residents of this area secure in their beds, unaware of the violence that had occurred behind the elegant facade of the Victorian house on the corner. Silas positioned himself beneath the bathroom window, looking up at the second-story opening where Grace's face appeared moments later. She had tied bedsheets together in the classic configuration that appeared in every prison escape movie. Grace lowered herself out the window with the controlled movements of someone who had been trained for emergency situations. Her background as a combat medic served her well, her body compact and efficient as she descended the sheet rope hand over hand. The fabric held until she was close enough for Deacon to catch her, both of them tumbling to the grass beneath the window in a controlled fall. They lay tangled together for a moment, breathing hard, listening for any sign that Victor had been awakened. The house remained dark and silent. Silas helped Grace to her feet, his hands gentle on arms that he knew were covered in bruises beneath her sleeves. She clutched a small bag to her chest, and he could see the outline of documents and a phone inside the evidence she had risked everything to gather. They moved quickly through the shadows, rejoining the vehicle, and speeding away through streets that were empty of traffic and witnesses. Grace sat in the back seat, trembling with residual adrenaline and the dawning realization that she had actually escaped, that she was actually preparing for the first time in months. "Thank you." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of profound gratitude. "I didn't think anyone would come." "Someone always comes," Silas said from the front seat. "Sometimes it just takes them a while to find their way." The evidence Grace had gathered was more comprehensive than Silas had dared to hope. Spread across the table in the Iron Reapers clubhouse, it told a story of systematic abuse and calculated murder that no jury could ignore. There were 3 years of insurance documents showing that Victor had dramatically increased the coverage on his first wife's life just weeks before her fatal accident. There were photographs of brake line damage that a mechanic friend had documented when Martha's car was impounded, damage that matched deliberate tampering rather than wear and failure. There were recordings Grace had made on her phone, hidden in her pocket during Victor's worst episodes, capturing his voice as he described in chilling detail how easy it had been to kill Martha and how easy it would be to do the same to Grace if she ever thought about leaving. And there was Grace's own documentation, 47 photographs of injuries sustained over 14 months, each one dated and time-stamped, each one showing bruises and cuts that Victor had carefully placed where clothing would cover them. Medical records from emergency room visits where Grace had lied about falling downstairs or walking into doors. A journal she had kept hidden, recording every incident in careful detail, creating a timeline of escalating violence that showed the deliberate pattern of an abuser tightening his control. Tommy sat at the table reviewing the legal implications, his professional training finally being applied to something that mattered. His face was pale as he read through the evidence, understanding both its power and its limitations. "This is enough to charge him with murder," Tommy said quietly. "Martha's death, the insurance fraud, the documented premeditation, combined with the domestic violence evidence and the recordings of his threats, we're looking at multiple felony charges that could put him away for life." "What about Emma?" Grace's voice was steady, but her hands trembled around the cup of coffee someone had pressed into them. "Victor will retaliate. The moment he realizes I'm gone, he'll make calls." "I've already reached out to contacts in London," Tommy replied. "Emma's firm has been quietly informed that there may be an attempt to interfere with her husband's visa application. They're lawyers, they know how to protect their own. And I've documented Victor's threats, which constitutes witness intimidation and obstruction. If he tries anything with Emma, he'll be adding federal charges to his list." Silas listened to the planning, but his mind kept returning to the press conference scheduled for Monday afternoon. Victor still thought he held all the cards. He was planning to announce the arrests of Iron Reapers members, to position himself as a victim of criminal harassment, to use the manufactured scandal to cement his position as the law and order candidate. He had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "The press conference," Silas said, interrupting the discussion. "We use it." Everyone turned to look at him. Victor's expecting to control the narrative. He's gathered the press, assembled his supporters, prepared his speech about being targeted by dangerous criminals. What if we give them a different story? Deacon caught on immediately. "You want to hijack his event." "I want to let Grace tell her truth to the same audience Victor assembled to hear his lies. She walks in with her evidence while the cameras are rolling. Victor can't stop her without proving everything she's about to say." Grace straightened in her chair, the trembling in her hands stilling as she processed the proposal. "He'll have security. His supporters will be hostile. We'll have people in the crowd. And once you start talking, once the evidence comes out, Victor's supporters are going to start looking for the exits." Silas met her eyes across the table. "You spent 14 months being terrorized. You spent 6 years before that serving your country under fire. I've seen soldiers with less steel in them than you've shown getting out of that house. Can you do this?" The question hung in the air while Grace weighed her fear against her fury, her caution against her courage. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had made a decision that could not be unmade. I was a combat medic. I kept soldiers alive while mortars fell around us. I didn't survive that to spend the rest of my life running from a man who thinks he can own me. She looked around the table at the weathered faces of the Iron Reapers, at Tommy in his wrinkled suit, at Silas, with his dying body and his undying determination. Yes, I can do this, but I'm not doing it just for me. I'm doing it for Martha, who didn't get the chance to tell anyone what he did to her. I'm doing it for every woman who's been told to stay quiet because the man hurting her was too powerful to fight. The planning continued through the night and into the next day. They mapped the town hall where the press conference would be held, identified entry points and exit routes, positioned club members at strategic locations throughout the building. Tommy prepared legal documents that would be needed once the revelations became public protective orders, criminal complaints, motions to preserve evidence. Silas also made a phone call to Sheriff Dale Perkins, a man he had known for 30 years and had saved from an IED in Iraq when Dale was a young sergeant and Silas was working as a private contractor. The debt between them had never been explicitly acknowledged, but both men knew it existed. Now Silas was calling it in. Dale, I need you at the town hall tomorrow. Not as Victor's friend, not as a politician looking for endorsements, as a law enforcement officer who swore an oath to protect people. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Silas Victor Crane is about to be mayor. If I move against him without solid evidence, the evidence will be there. A woman is going to stand up in front of those cameras and tell the truth about what Victor has done to her. She has documents, recordings, photographs. She has proof that Victor murdered his first wife. All I need from you is to be there, to be ready to act when the truth comes out. Another pause. This woman, she's willing to go public. She's willing to go to war. She's a veteran Dale, combat medic in Desert Storm. She's been through worse than Victor Crane, and she's done being afraid. When Dale finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his career. I'll be there. But Silas, if this goes wrong, if she can't back up what she's saying, it won't go wrong, and she can back up every word. Monday afternoon arrived with the particular clarity that Montana autumns sometimes achieved. The sky a deep blue that seemed to press down on the earth with the weight of coming winter. The town hall parking lot filled with vehicles as residents and press gathered for what they expected to be a routine political announcement. Silas watched from across the street, tracking the arrivals, identifying the security personnel Victor had stationed at various points around the building. Everything appeared normal, the standard choreography of a campaign event unfolding according to script. Victor himself arrived at 1:45, emerging from his Lexus with the practiced smile of a man who believed he controlled every variable. He did not notice the motorcycles parked on the surrounding streets. He did not recognize the weathered faces of the men who drifted into the town hall among the ordinary citizens. He did not see Grace Holloway enter through a side door escorted by Tommy and two Iron Reapers who had exchanged their leather vests for ordinary jackets. The trap was set. Now it just needed to spring. Victor took the podium at exactly 2 o'clock, his voice projecting the confident sincerity of a man who had rehearsed every gesture, every pause, every emotional beat. The speech began with platitudes about community safety and civic responsibility, building toward the dramatic revelation that would establish Victor as a crime-fighting hero. He was just reaching the transition point, the moment where he would announce the evidence of criminal surveillance and call for the arrest of those responsible, when a voice from the back of the room cut through his practiced cadence. Grace Holloway walked forward and the cameras swung toward her. The cameras captured everything that followed their unblinking lenses, recording the moment when Victor Crane's carefully constructed world began its irreversible collapse. Grace walked toward the podium with the measured stride of someone who had rehearsed this confrontation in her mind 1,000 times, her face pale, but composed, her hands steady at her sides. Victor's expressions cycled through confusion, recognition, and barely controlled rage in the space of 3 seconds. He gripped the podium as if it were the only thing keeping him upright, his knuckles whitening against the polished wood. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Grace Holloway. Her voice carried across the room with surprising strength, amplified by the microphone she had taken from a startled aide. For the past 14 months, I have been in a relationship with Victor Crane. For the past 12 months, he has been systematically abusing me. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was the sound of collective disbelief struggling against the evidence of their own eyes. Victor stepped forward, his face arranged into an expression of concerned bewilderment, but Grace continued before he could interrupt. I have photographs documenting injuries he inflicted on me over the course of our relationship. I have recordings of him threatening to kill me if I ever told anyone what happened in our home. And I have documents proving that his first wife, Martha Crane, did not die in an accident. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Audience members rose from their seats in confusion and alarm. Victor's security personnel moved toward Grace, but they found their path blocked by men who had positioned themselves throughout the hall, weathered faces and hard eyes that promised consequences for anyone who interfered. Silas watched from his position near the exit, his hand resting on the phone that would summon additional support if needed. The plan was unfolding exactly as they had designed it, Grace commanding the attention of the press, while Victor's options narrowed with every passing second. Any violent response would be captured by a dozen cameras. Any denial would be contradicted by evidence that was already being distributed to every reporter in the room. Victor chose denial, his voice rising above the chaos with the practiced projection of a courtroom attorney. This woman is mentally unstable. She's been manipulated by criminal elements who want to destroy my campaign. Everything she's saying is a lie fabricated by the Iron Reaper's motorcycle gang. Then explain these. Grace held up her phone, its screen displaying a photograph of her torso covered in bruises that formed the unmistakable pattern of fists and fingers. Explain why I have 47 photographs like this one dated and time-stamped over the past year. Explain why I have recordings of you describing how you sabotaged your first wife's car. She pressed play on the phone and Victor's own voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. The recording was one Grace had made during a night when Victor had been drinking, when his arrogance had overcome his caution and he had boasted about his cleverness in eliminating a wife who had become inconvenient. Martha was going to leave me and take half of everything. I couldn't allow that. The break lines were elegant, really. One cut in the right place, and physics did the rest. Everyone felt so sorry for me at the funeral. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that precedes earthquakes and revolutions. Victor's face had gone gray, his composure finally cracking under the weight of his own words played back for public consumption. He looked around the room as if searching for allies, but found only the hungry eyes of journalists who recognized the story of their careers unfolding before them. That recording is fabricated. It's been manipulated by technology. Victor's voice had lost its confident resonance, the words coming out thin and desperate. Tommy stepped forwards from his position near the side door, his appearance drawing a fresh wave of murmurs from the crowd. I'm Thomas Cade, and until yesterday I was a member of Victor Crane's campaign staff. I'm also a licensed attorney with 15 years of experience, and I can confirm that the recordings you're hearing have been authenticated by independent experts. Victor's eyes locked onto Tommy with an expression of pure hatred. You're part of this. Your father is the leader of that motorcycle gang. This is a family conspiracy. My father is a man who spent his life protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Tommy's voice carried the weight of recent revelation of truths finally acknowledged after years of denial. Victor Crane used information about a past mistake to coerce me into working for his campaign. He threatened to destroy my career if I didn't cooperate. I have documentation of that coercion, and I'm prepared to testify to everything I witnessed during my time in his organization. The press conference had transformed into something unprecedented, a public trial conducted in real time before cameras that would carry the footage to every news outlet in the state. Reporters abandoned any pretense of orderly questioning, shouting inquiries that overlapped into cacophony. Victor's remaining supporters began edging toward the exits, the instinct for self-preservation overriding whatever loyalty they had felt toward a man whose destruction was now inevitable. Sheriff Dale Perkins pushed through the crowd, his uniform marking him as the authority figure the situation demanded. He had been watching from the back of the room, his presence arranged by Silas as a contingency against the chaos that was now unfolding. His face showed the conflict of a man caught between duty and the political realities of small-town Montana, but his voice was steady when he spoke. Victor Crane, I need you to come with me for questioning regarding the allegations that have been raised here today. Victor's desperation was palpable now, his polished facade completely shattered. "You can't do this. I'm the leading candidate for mayor. I have rights. I'm not arresting you. I'm asking you to cooperate with an investigation into serious allegations." Dale's tone hardened. "We can do this quietly or we can do it in front of these cameras. Your choice." Victor looked around the room one final time, perhaps hoping to find some escape route, some ally who would step forward to defend him. Instead, he saw only the hungry eyes of journalists, the satisfied expressions of Iron Reapers members, and the steady gaze of Grace Holloway, the woman he had thought he owned, now standing tall as the architect of his destruction. Something in Victor's eyes changed. The desperate calculation gave way to fury, the mask of civilization dropping to reveal the predator beneath. He moved faster than anyone expected, lunging toward Grace with hands outstretched, reaching for the throat of the woman who had dared to expose him. He never reached her. Silas stepped between them, his body moving with the muscle memory of decades of combat training. He caught Victor's wrist, twisted it into a joint lock that dropped the younger man to his knees and held him there, with the calm efficiency of someone who had subdued far more dangerous opponents. For a moment, Silas had Victor completely at his mercy. He could feel the man's pulse racing beneath his grip, could see the fear in eyes that had only ever known power and control. It would be so easy to add pressure to feel bones crack, to deliver some small portion of the pain that Victor had inflicted on so many others. But Maggie Chen's voice echoed in his memory. "You won't hurt him, will you? I don't want anyone to get hurt." And Grace's voice carrying the weight of her own hard-won wisdom. "The cycle of violence has to end somewhere." Silas released Victor's wrist and stepped back, his hands raised in clear view of the cameras. His voice carried across the room with the quiet certainty of a man who had made his choice. "I could break every bone in your body, and no jury in Montana would convict me. But I'm not going to give you that satisfaction. You don't deserve a warrior's death. You deserve a cage and years to think about everyone you've hurt and the knowledge that a woman you thought you owned is the one who put you there." Sheriff Perkins moved in to take custody, handcuffs clicking shut around wrists that had never expected to wear them. Victor was still sputtering protests as he was led from the room, but no one was listening anymore. The story had moved beyond him, had become about the survivors rather than the perpetrator. Grace stood at the podium, tears streaming down her face, surrounded by reporters who were finally asking the right questions. She answered them all with the steady composure of someone who had found her voice after too long in silence, telling her story in her own words, refusing to let anyone else control the narrative of her suffering and her survival. Tommy was beside her, providing legal context for her statements, fielding questions about evidence and procedure with the professional competence that had been wasted for too long on the wrong causes. Father and son exchanged a look across the room, not reconciliation, not yet, but the beginning of something that might eventually heal. And Silas slipped out a side door, leaving the chaos behind, walking toward his motorcycle in the afternoon sun. Harold Crane died that night before his son could be formally arraigned. The cancer had been racing against the clock of Victor's exposure, and it won by a matter of hours. Some said the old man had lost the will to fight once he understood that his legacy would be destruction rather than dynasty. Others said it was simply his time, the universe's accounting, finally coming due for decades of accumulated sins. Silas received the news without satisfaction. Harold Crane had escaped human judgment, had died in his comfortable bed, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power. But his confession was recorded, his crimes documented, and his name would forever be associated with the corruption he had spent his life perfecting. Gerald Roberts died 2 weeks later in Arizona, his testimony already entered into the official record. Danny Cade was posthumously exonerated, the state finally acknowledging that an innocent young man had been murdered in their custody on the orders of a corrupt judge. The grave that Silas had visited every year for 4 decades now bore a marker that told the truth: Daniel Robert Cade, 1962 to 1984, innocent. Victor Crane's trial took 6 months. The evidence was overwhelming, not just Grace's documentation and the recordings, but additional victims who came forward once they understood that Victor's power had finally been broken. Women from his past colleagues who had witnessed his cruelty, even Martha's sister, who had always suspected that her death was not an accident. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The sentence was life without parole. Victor would spend his remaining years in a prison cell surrounded by men who knew exactly what he had done and felt no particular obligation to make his incarceration comfortable. The Chrome and Ashes Foundation was officially incorporated 3 months after Victor's conviction, funded by a settlement from civil suits against the Crane estate, and organized around the principle that had guided Silas from the beginning. Sometimes the smallest voice carries the most important message. Maggie Chen served on the Youth Advisory Board, helping to design outreach programs that encouraged children to speak up when they witnessed abuse. Her mother, Dr. Maylin Chen, provided medical services to victims transitioning out of dangerous situations. Grace trained volunteers in trauma-informed response, teaching them to hear what victims were really saying beneath the words they used. Tommy Cade gave up corporate law entirely, opening a small practice in Copper Ridge that specialized in helping abuse survivors navigate the legal system. He visited his father every week, their conversations gradually filling in the gaps that 15 years of silence had created. Silas watched all of this unfold with the particular clarity that comes from knowing your time is limited. The cancer progressed according to the timeline the doctors had predicted, stealing strength and stamina month by month, transforming him from the formidable presence he had once been into something more fragile, more human. He didn't fight it. He had done what he set out to do, had kept the promise he made to an 8-year-old girl in a school parking lot. Danny had been vindicated. Grace had been freed. Victor was paying for his crimes. The foundation would continue the work long after Silas was gone. One evening in late May, as the Montana spring softened into the first hints of summer, Silas sat on the porch of the small house where Grace had been staying. They had become companions over the preceding months, two people who understood each other's damage and didn't require explanations. Not lovers, they were both too old and too weary for the complications of romance, but something equally valuable. Partners, friends, fellow survivors. Grace brought him coffee and sat in the chair beside him, both of them watching the sun set behind the mountains. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that only develops between people who have faced death together and lived to tell about it. "I never thanked you properly," Grace said finally, "for everything. For believing Maggie when no one else would. For coming for me that night. For giving me back my life." Silas shook his head slowly. "You gave yourself back your life. I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it. You're dying." The words were matter of fact, the observation of a woman who had spent too many years in medicine to pretend otherwise. "How much time do you have left?" "Weeks, maybe a month or two if I'm lucky." He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "But I've made my peace with it. I've done more living in the past 6 months than in the previous 20 years. Any regrets?" Silas considered the question carefully, turning it over in his mind, the way he had turned over so many questions during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. "I wish I'd found a way to reach Tommy sooner. I wish I'd been a better father, a better husband. I wish I could have saved Danny." He paused, looking out at the fading light. "But I can't change any of that. All I can do is try to make the time I have left count for something." Grace reached over and took his hand, her grip warm and steady. "It already has, more than you know." They sat together as darkness fell, two people who had walked through fire and emerged scarred but standing. In the distance, a motorcycle engine rumbled to life, probably Deacon heading home after another day of foundation work. The sound was a reminder that life continued, that the world kept turning, that the work they had started would go on without them. Silas Cade died on a Tuesday morning in early June, with Grace holding his hand and the Montana sunrise painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. He went quietly without struggle, his body finally surrendering to the disease that had been his constant companion for the past 7 months. The last thing he saw was the light of a new day breaking over the mountains he had loved all his life. The funeral was held at the Iron Reapers Clubhouse, a space transformed by flowers and photographs, and the presence of a community that had grown far larger than the original brotherhood. Bikers stood alongside teachers, lawyers beside mechanics, children beside elderly veterans. The boundaries that had once divided Copper Ridge had blurred and faded, replaced by connections forged in shared purpose. Maggie Chen read the eulogy she had written, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her face. She was 10 years old now, taller and more confident, but still carrying the serious expression that had characterized her from the beginning. Mr. Silas taught me that heroes don't always look like heroes, she read from the paper in her hands. Sometimes they're old men on motorcycles who look scary but say thank you to waitresses. Sometimes they're teachers who are afraid but stand up anyway. Sometimes they're kids who write letters even when everyone tells them not to. She looked up at the gathered crowd, at the faces of people whose lives had been changed by a chain of events that started with a single letter left on a motorcycle. Mr. Silas said that everyone has the power to be a hero if they're brave enough to speak up when something is wrong. I think he was right. And I think the best way to remember him is to keep speaking up, keep helping people, keep being brave even when we're scared. She returned to her seat beside her mother, and the memorial continued with stories and songs and the particular celebration of life that motorcycle clubs had perfected over generations of honoring their dead. After the formal ceremony, when the crowd had thinned and the afternoon shadows were lengthening across the parking lot, Deacon approached the memorial table where photographs of Silas had been arranged. He placed something among them, a folded piece of notebook paper, worn and creased from being carried in his pocket for months. It was Maggie's original letter, the one she had left on Silas's motorcycle on a September evening that now seemed like a lifetime ago. The careful handwriting was still visible, the words that had started everything still legible, despite the wear. "Dear motorcycle man," it began, "I think the bad men are hurting my teacher." Beside the letter, Deacon placed a new document, the first annual report of the Chrome and Ashes Foundation. It showed the number of victims, helped the resources distributed, the lives changed by an organization that existed because one child had refused to stay silent and one dying man had refused to look away. The foundation would continue. The work would go on. And somewhere perhaps Silas Cade was riding on roads without end, finally at peace. 1 year later, on the anniversary of Silas's death, the foundation held its first memorial event. The organization had grown beyond anyone's expectations, with chapters now operating in 6 Montana cities and inquiries coming from neighboring states. Maggie Chen, now 11, stood at the podium to present the first annual Silas Cade Award for Courage. The recipient was a 12-year-old boy from Billings who had helped his mother escape a violent relationship by documenting evidence and contacting the foundation's hotline. Grace sat in the front row wearing a simple gold necklace that had been Silas's final gift. She had kept teaching, kept working with the foundation, kept building the community that Silas had envisioned. She had learned to carry his memory not as a burden, but as a gift, a reminder of what was possible when people chose courage over comfort. Tommy sat beside her, their friendship deepening over the year of shared grief and shared purpose. His law practice had grown, drawing clients from across the state who had heard about the attorney who fought for abuse survivors without caring about billable hours. Deacon delivered the closing remarks, his rough voice carrying the weight of 50 years of brotherhood and the wisdom of a man who had seen too much and still found reasons to hope. Silas used to say that we all have ghosts, things we've done, people we've failed, choices we regret. He carried his ghosts for a long time, too long maybe, but in the end he found a way to make peace with them. Not by forgetting, but by doing something that mattered, by using whatever time he had left to help someone who needed help. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of bikers and teachers and doctors and lawyers and children, all of them bound together by the legacy of one man's final months. The best way to honor Silas isn't to build monuments or write speeches. It's to do what he did. It's to see someone who needs help and step forward instead of looking away. It's to believe children when they tell us something is wrong. It's to be brave enough to speak the truth even when the truth is dangerous. He raised his glass in the traditional toast. To Silas Cade, soldier brother, father friend. He lived hard, loved harder, and left this world better than he found it. May his road rise to meet him. May the wind be always at his back, and may he ride forever on roads without end. The response came from every voice in the room. Ride forever, brother. Ride forever. Outside, the Montana sky stretched endless and blue, watching over a community that would continue to grow, continue to heal, continue to help. The work was never finished. There would always be another child crying out, another woman trapped, another voice that needed to be heard. But now there were people listening. Now there were hands reaching out. Now there was hope.